Hello,
Hello, we're back again.
he's Shabazz.
Here's Pete Marshall, and this is Crypt Chat UK. And what are we talking about today, Pete Marshall?
Today we're talking about the Barrington Declaration,
Could you tell me
and
what that is?
it's a petition that was done in Barrington, in I think the US, and basically it was done by a financier and a whole load of and a think tank and a whole bunch of people, and it's got ridiculously famous given how few people have actually signed it, and essentially it's about not doing lockdowns, which it
Yeah,
honestly
so
doesn't.
it's a petition regarding COVID 19, right?
Yes, but it's kind of the most famous one because it has the most money behind it. It has financiers behind it. So basically, they've managed to leverage a whole load of think tanks and a whole load of um, and a whole load of ridiculously big names. Not given the cash probably, but ridiculously big names in kind of cultural and policy terms. How much it's actually wrong. And so yeah, it made the Spectator and it made a whole load of newspapers, which, just to say, one of the funnier things, Rick Burgess, one of our friends, um, he signed the petition as like Professor something or other. And apparently it just lets you sign up, like anyone who wants to be can just sign up as a professor or a doctor or anything.
So me and
And
you both could be professors.
exactly, we could both go up in the world.
Oh, wow. Just by
Dr. Pro-
signing a petition.
Dr. Professor Shabazz. It
Oh,
has a ring to it.
fucking hell, that sounds dangerous to me.
And you too could have a significant impact on policy if you just sign up to this
Yeah,
thing.
hopefully the right way around, not the wrong way around. So, so could you give us me and everybody else around the world uh, a little overview of what their central aim is?
I mean, essentially, they try to do a very kind of academic gloss on trying to say that, like, oh, it has an entire section which is being all like, oh, we want to minimize casualties. And I mean, the furthest thing it actually gives in terms of actual policy, in terms of actually trying to be anti-COVID, is it has an entire thing about, oh, young people will go out and do work, but old people will have to like stay at home all the time, which is kind of dumb, given the fact that, I mean, we've had discussions before on the podcast about just how like broad vulnerable people are, and just how many vulnerable people you would have to take back into the economy, and just how rarely you would actually be able to, like, people would actually be able to have places that were like COVID safe, you know. And so honestly, the idea of having of being able to run society in this way, that, it's impossible. But honestly, it's vague. So, maybe if we lived in Star Trek world, then then the Barrington Declaration might actually have legs. So I suppose that would be what they would probably argue. Um, and yeah, so I think so. Um, yeah, it's deliberately vague on the important bits, but it's very specific about, like, oh, lockdown is a bad thing, and it does a lot leveraging the the recognized kind of disadvantages of lockdown, which, is very bad for poverty. If you started off in poverty, then it gets worse during lockdown, and it is also bad for education. And those two things are completely correct. I mean, you could argue that if you have governments and um, companies and various groups who are prepared to actually, like, put in the policies to actually make things better, actually the effects of coronavirus in that sense have been vastly different depending on how much the government has actually done to help. But it doesn't talk about that because again, it wants to imply that like, oh, lockdown is a menace on all human beings and all people equally, and there's nothing we can do about it. Therefore, therefore the only possible way forward is to not do lockdown.
Let's be absolutely clear. Lockdown is fucking annoying, right?
Yeah, it
But,
sucks.
but we're not. I'm not disputing that. But
and
I'm
honestly, like
saying,
if lockdown was if the counter answer, if the other thing on the table was anything other than death for large amounts of people, then lockdown will be a massive imposition on human rights.
yeah.
It's also worth acknowledging that.
And with the emergence of the understanding of long COVID being
Yeah.
the actual thing as well, and
Although
the
I will,
idea that only the old and the vulnerable, all they need to do is be locked away for however long this virus wants to circulate for. All we have to do is lock them away. Not only is that discrimination, that is also ageism and
I mean,
all of the other things.
I would take it from a different angle than that. I mean, quite apart from it is impossible to argue that you're a culture that respects like rights if you're discriminating against these groups like that. I would argue that it's just impossible to run an economy. Realistically, like my mum is a social worker. My mum does necessary work. She does, blah blah blah. Equally though, she has asthma.
Yeah.
She is amongst, and so honestly, if you actually go through the numbers of people who have various issues, but equally they have incredibly important jobs, if society is going back to work, they have to go back to work.
Yeah.
And so in the end, there's a massive thing around this of just, it's like, it is economically non-viable. Let's put it like that. It's, the economy is not, if they're imagining that like that there's an easy break here, there isn't. There's an incredibly large gray area, and what happens to them is probably going to be grim in the extreme. They're not going to have what's realistically going to happen is they're not going to have the accommodations made, because if that's not being made for massive amounts of people, then they're just not going to be made. So what would end so then accommodations would be made, so then people who are vulnerable would be forced back into work, so then they would end up getting COVID. So so honestly, their argument that there's this panacea solution, that there's an easy break in the population between the vulnerable and the old and the non-vulnerable and the young, honestly, like, just think about like our current government. How, are we going to fire our entire government, including Boris Johnson? Are we going to fire like the entire American government and Donald Trump and all that, and just put young people in there? I mean, you might argue that's quite a good idea, but like equally, that, realistically, like, if if the economy goes back, then there's no point in talking about like, oh well, a certain amount of, then vulnerable people would have to go back into the economy.
Look at Donald Trump. He's in his 70s. Look at Boris Johnson. He's in his 50s. They both had it.
So I think, yeah. So I think the idea of, so I think if it was, if they were writing fiction, then there would be an interesting story. But realistically, like, yes. But let's take it from let's talk about this from a different angle, because I think in some ways, the Barrington Declaration is not, it's it's bad policy and bad science, but I think it's also emblematic of a more kind of a wider interesting topic, and that's kind of the both-sidesism that has crept into our discussions around lockdown and discussions around COVID. And
Could you explain what you mean by both-sidism?
I mean,
I know what you mean, but for
yeah.
everybody else.
I mean, this is mainly discussed around kind of cigarettes and around, well, that was in the 60s, 70s, and around climate change most recently, where basically there is this journalistic instinct to go, well, we're talking about lockdown, so let's try and find somebody who can go who can oppose it. And in the end, and you know, no matter how crazy or no matter how that person's opinion should in no sense be given like be actually discussed, there's a sense in which like objectivity is more important than truth, which is hugely problematic, and it ends up meaning that loads of people end up going, and you know, it's interesting that if you that I actually ran the numbers on the number of people who do the petition, and there is 1.2 million. This is what, and this is from the kind of the scientists. This is official scientists. This is primary, so this is not people who supply scientists, but this is from there's 1.2 million people who are registered as a form of scientist or expert or kind of that kind of thing. 1.2 million, and of that group, you know, 12, you know, at this point something like 12,000. And honestly, like that's under 1%. That is a very fringe opinion. That is at the same level as like climate change denialism, or like, you know, flat eartherism is probably lower amongst geologists and things, but still, the broad, you know, it is a very fringe opinion. And so for newspapers and for news sources to be talking about this in the same sentence as like, oh, there, you know, to talk about, oh, there are people who like there are people who like the current set of policies, and there are epidemiologists who don't. Well, there aren't really epidemiologists who don't. There is one, and we will talk about her later on. But yeah.
Why do you think that they've got so much weight? Is it because of the amount of financing of money, or?
I mean, part of it is this. I mean, the first thing, and this gets us to both-sidesism, is I think this notion around journalistic objectivity, and this is a notion
of the BBC theory of getting a balanced view.
I mean, to be fair, it's much wider than the BBC. And to be fair, like if you look at climate change, it's actually like only in the last couple of years that people have genuinely been like, yeah, we don't care about like climate change denialists. They are wrong, you know. And in the end, so basically, like you could have gone from the Daily Mail to the Guardian, and you'd have found this like notion around like, well, journalism is fundamentally about getting all sides of a picture and then just like hashing it out. And the problem with that is that like as soon as you allow people to hash something out, then they kind of have this image in their head of trying to get to the middle point for many of them. And honestly, the problem with that is if the scientific community is not in the middle, if like 98% of them agree on one think this thing and 2% of them think this, then if the population thinks that, you know, maybe there's man-made climate change, you end up in a very different position than scientists who are 98% yes, humans are causing climate change. And in the end, in this, like if many people end up going, well, what arguments would the if many people end up thinking, well, what arguments would this presumably, like the fact I saw a debate about lockdown means that there is like a large proportion of like respected academics who are talking about like who are thinking about lockdown and arguing against it. And again, if those people don't exist, then then basically then it is null and moot, and the population have been misinformed.
Yeah,
their beliefs are not true.
There's a human need for rebellion, though, isn't it?
I think,
going against the status quo, even before the last few years, you know,
I mean, especially when I think with lockdown, especially part of it is also the fact that it's very much disrupting routines.
Yeah.
And as soon as you're disrupting someone's routines, then basically they're having to make an overt decision not to do something. It's very easy to get someone to keep on doing something. It's very difficult to go, yeah, you can't do that. And asking people to not do lots of things, it's never going to be easy or popular. Like, that's
No.
not like, it's, and honestly, part of this thing, I think, should be, again, should be about making sure making sure society is as open, is as kind of functional, is as entertaining, honestly, as possible.
Yeah.
And and schools are happening, and um and routines can be gone through.
Yeah.
How you do that is, to some degree, part of the problem with all that is it requires a level of competence and a willingness to spend money, which the current government seems to be very unwilling to do on both fronts, honestly. So I think, so yeah,
And I
honestly, I
know I've
think,
already, and I know I've already done this, but I think there needs to be a constant acknowledgement that we understand the current circumstances are very, very difficult for us
and
all. But that's not a reason for not to do them, you know?
I think as well, it's worth pointing out that they're temporary.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that I've noticed with is loads of people seem to have got into the mindset that whatever is happening now, and again, I'm somewhat caricaturing it, and but whatever is happening now is going to happen for the rest of time, or at least for for a long time. And in some ways, like, I guess I tend to think of this as lasting until the end of next year. Again, not based on any specific data, I grant, but it's not going to.
I think you're wise about doing that.
But again,
Because,
so I think that's yeah. But that's a
sorry,
safe.
go on. Sorry, go on.
Basically, that's kind of a safe time.
Yeah.
But in the end, if it continues until I'm like 40, then I will start getting very irritated, and to put it mildly. And no, Boris Johnson will not be able to do this for the rest of my life. And in the end, let's be perfectly frank with each other. Let's say that Boris Johnson does feel like keeping everyone in their houses so he can stay in power. Yeah, that's not going to fly. Like, in the end, we can rebel as much next year or the year after as we can right now.
Yeah. And I was just going to say, there's not many things that I agree with you on, but that kind of mindset, I would wholeheartedly agree with you on. Is, for example, if you thought it was going to be in your head, if you thought it would be over in January, it's like that. That in my mind is too short a time span for you to put a deadline in your head. The end of next year is, at least in my mind, a lot more realistic, and you're not gonna be letting yourself down, or making yourself more angry because you've given yourself too short a time span. If that makes sense.
There's probably there's probably going to be two waves in that time, and we're kind of at the start of the second wave, and there's going to be a dip in between. But having said that,
I know we're not here to talk about first and second waves and yada yada yada, but one thing I would like to say for the record, I'm still fucking disappointed and annoyed that we haven't done more. We haven't done more preparation for the second wave. Like, as a country and as a global society, I feel that we could have done a bit more. Like, get schools more ready with technology, for example.
Honestly, I was talking to one of my activisty friends immediately before this, and she was absolutely fuming that apparently two of her friends who have children in who have special educational needs and in special schools. Yes, I don't like those terms, but anyway, for the sake of this, basically it's yeah, basically both of them. They're a massive part of what they do is transition training. So it's around ensuring that that it isn't too harsh going from one year to the next, going from and none of that had happened at all, nor were they given any homework,
Yeah.
which honestly the parents were a bit like, oh well, does that, you don't care about our children's education is just not important enough to
Yeah.
bother doing.
And for example, I've also heard that some exams have already been delayed by 3 weeks, like for next year. You know, so for all the
We'll see how
schooling
long
that
that
you
lasts.
missed, 3 weeks isn't going to cut it. I don't think, in my opinion. So I just wanted to say that, as a side note, that we should again we could have done more. I know that's always the case, but in this kind of emergency, when we knew that this was kind of coming,
Honestly, I would argue that I would feel better if our government was took this more from the perspective of how can we need to do as much as we can, and if we end up doing a bit too much, then
yeah,
that would be the angle I would take on it. I find it odd that they're just like, well, if we do a little bit and that ends up being, it ends up being a little too little, well,
it feels to me like the people that are making these decisions, in the back of their mind or in the front of their mind, I don't know which, they're kind of hoping that this would just kind of disappear. And they just
yeah.
keep buying time and time.
I think that there was a distinct, and honestly, it's somewhat bizarre in the sense that, like, if you go back to the end of the first wave, right at the start of the end of that, there was already analysts who were saying that there was going to be a second wave. Like, they were already talking about, like, so honestly, in some ways, I would love to be like, oh, I'm a genius for thinking that there was going to be more than one wave, but like,
Yeah,
it was in the Times. Like,
yeah,
I'm sorry, like it was hardly in like some incredibly obscure documents.
yeah.
Honestly, if so yeah,
It
there was.
wasn't. It wasn't just. It wasn't only known in secret service circles that there was gonna be. There was gonna be. There was gonna be a second wave. It wasn't classified information. It was out there in public, in the public realm. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, like
And
it was. Yeah.
yeah. So the other part of this is we were going to talk about was about the Oxford Union.
2 points here
Okay.
because one of them is there is an individual called Professor Suna Gupta who constantly gets raised as one as the only epidemiologist, and I think that the only kind of Oxford incredibly reputable and epidemiologist. And just to point out that in her official biography, her only actually special, like, what she does is specifically to malaria, influenza, and bacterial meningitis. So, you'll notice that COVID is not mentioned in there. There's a separate epidemiological department for COVID, which is actually doing some fantastic work and has done some of the best research. But like, she is not part of that. And as much as I'm sure her ideas on lots of other things are interesting and worthy and blah blah blah, and she seems to be very eminent, I'm not sure if this is the best time for her to be weighing in with her opinions. I will also say one of the more one of the more bizarre predictions she made was that there was going to be this like 1 in every 10,000 or 1 in every 100,000 death rate, which is a theory that has already been proven wrong. So again, it would be one thing if this wasn't her speciality, but she happened to be right. Honestly, she's already kind of wrong, and we've barely even we've barely even started. So I don't know if, and honestly, I don't like doing hit jobs on people, but I think that her name keeps on getting put forward in basically every positive article around this declaration. And honestly, it just it just irritates me in the sense that they're trying to leverage her respectability. And honestly, like, it does sound like she's a very eminent epidemiologist who probably does great work in bacterial meningitis and influenza and malaria. And honestly, those are important topics and blah blah blah. All of that, but like, is this the best time for us to be listening to her? And is this really the topic on which she should be like spending quite so much of her professional currency on? It does feel a little bit like there are many topics I don't know about. I don't pretend to be an expert in those topics, and I try not to like say things that will make people act in very specific ways, because there's a very high chance of me being wrong.
Yeah, a few things to say on that. First being, to be fair to her, and I hate that you're putting me in the kind of devil's advocate.
The balanced position.
Yeah, that's not a position I'm comfortable with. That's like me stepping on loads of nails barefoot. Anyway, to be fair to her, COVID-19 is a very recent, you know, well, nearly a year old, but a very recent.
I mean,
virus.
I'll just say two things. I mean, COVID is an entire family of diseases.
Yeah.
And COVID-19 was the COVID strain that came along in 2019.
Yeah.
So
yeah. So what I was trying to say was, it's very hard to get an expert on that particular condition at this moment in time, possibly. So just to be fair to her, just in case she's listening. But the other point I wanted to make was, maybe, I don't know, maybe she just ticks a lot of boxes. Like, she works for the Oxford Union, and she sounds like she's from an ethnic minority background, and she's a woman. So she does tick like a few boxes there. I don't know what I'm saying about that, but I'm just putting that out there.
I will also say that I think that there's an interesting discussion. And again, this is part of why World Health Organization has been being distinctly less vociferously pro-lockdown, which is, again, back to the poverty discussion. In the end, lockdown is very bad for people in poverty. In the end, the more you can, the more wealth you have, the more you can adapt. And in the end, and I think, and especially if you look at India, actually, there has been some massive missteps around how to deal with the confluence between poverty and lockdown, and combinations of their government hasn't been wonderful at doing this. And actually, I think no one really thought about it. Like, to be fair, like it first, like, and I think in loads of countries. So I think if she's thinking mainly about if like her worldview is a lot more if that's a lot more in the front of mind, then I can understand why she would go, well, lockdowns aren't great. But then you start applying that to the UK and you kind of go, well, we can afford lockdowns. Yeah. And in the end, if we wanted to put more money into it as a nation, more people could afford afford a lot more comfortable lockdowns. Yeah. So many of the arguments around poverty get a lot weaker when you start in this particular context.
Without coming across as a hippie or anything like that, I would say that I would argue that lockdowns are are an investment in life, are an investment in the future, because the more people you've got alive, is the more people you've got the chance to spend money once lockdown is over.
Hmm.
You know, we're gonna all need new stuff, new clothes, new computers, new all this, that, the other. Well, once lockdown is over, so and your healthcare system doesn't collapse either by 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 keeping people comfortable and warm in their own
It's
homes.
it's also worth pointing out, and again, this has traditionally been less of a British thing, but but given the fact that we've had loads of earthquakes recently, maybe it's becoming a more British thing. The worse one of the problems with COVID is that it makes international cooperation a lot harder. Now, one of the issues around that is if you have a disaster at the same time as COVID, then that's when stuff gets really serious, because basically, like, how do you do a lockdown if there's an earthquake or if there's a forest fire?
Right.
And so
I didn't even think of that.
I mean, in California, they've actually had that. In Eastern Europe, they had an earthquake. So basically, there's an entire thing of actually the less, if you can one of the things, if you can stop people from spreading the disease, then, and if you have it as less of a baseline thing, then anything that goes wrong is less of an issue. One of the things about California forest fires, one of the reasons they've been so much worse this year is traditionally they have Australian forest. Australia is another country with massive forest fires, and basically California and Australia have basically have cooperation agreements. Now, given US and California and their COVID crises, Australia did not provide any new planes. They didn't provide helicopters. They didn't provide crews. So it's also worth pointing out that this isn't just an issue around. In many ways, COVID isn't just an issue around economy. It isn't just an issue. It's also an issue around, like, what happened around. Actually, like, if you look at the discussions on collapse of civilization. Generally, one disaster doesn't collapse a civilization. 2 or 3 or 4 disasters start being a lot harder because they start compounding on each other. And COVID is one disaster in itself. But the question is, you don't get to decide when another disaster happens. It just happens. And then you basically have to deal with that plus COVID. And you have to try and work out how to, like, manage the two of them together. Yeah. And so it is, even from that perspective, it is severely advisable to do everything you can to deal with COVID early. And then if anything else happens, then your baseline is a lot lower. And even if it does slip up a bit, you have more breathing room, and you have and you have more time, and you have more options in front of
you. Yeah, and just on the disaster point, I just wanted to make a little point that not only have we in the UK have forgotten COVID, people have forgotten about Brexit. Brexit is still going on, and that I know you're looking at me as if you don't want to talk about that, but that is going to affect our economy.
I mean, honestly, on the disaster point, it's going to have a massive effect, because in the end, right now, we are getting large amounts of goods. Gloves apparently are a massive thing. That apparently, like, there's some difficulty with most of our supply lines are international, and honestly, most of our trade agreements are via the EU.
Yeah.
So in the end, it is in this context, Brexit might turn into a. There's a very high chance Brexit will turn into a half disaster. I mean, again, we can have massive debates about whether Brexit's good or bad, but in this particular context, it significantly decreases options and means that we have to be relying on some of the, shall we say, facts that that we hopefully have. And in the end, if COVID's already taking up that and decreasing options further, yeah.
Yeah. I didn't want to throw you a curveball. I just thought it was worth mentioning when you were talking about disasters, because to me the Brexit argument is irrelevant now. The point is that it's happening, and it's just a case of what kind of Brexit happens. You know, that is what I'm interested in.
And it's hard to work, and it's hard. It's hard. There haven't been that many optimistic headlines on that particular issue, have
No,
there?
but it's bubbling around in the background. Anyway, going back to lockdowns, one of the other things I wanted to say was, in my experience and in my day-to-day life, I have seen what's been interesting to me is being middle class and wealthier people arguing against lockdowns for 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 the poorest of people, and that's been kind of interesting to me.
I mean, I think that there's an element in this. It's very similar to racism, that I think society likes to talk to like impose those things on poor people and go, well, these poor people, they can't help it. This is just what they're like. And I think, and honestly, like, that's an entire discourse, and I could bitch about that, but I think in many ways it does. Realistically, if you're from a council estate, your opinion on lockdown is not going to have that much effect. I'm sorry to say, but I think that there's a lot more intricate arguments about. There is actually a kind of. There's actually Maria and David Willits, who are they're financiers, and they do a great deal of work with Oxford and Cambridge, and by all accounts they have a great deal to do with and they've been doing a great deal of anti-lockdown work, and because they can spend millions every year on Oxford and Cambridge and give these places beautiful new halls, I'm sure that means that they also get more freedom and more choice around, and that means that they can start pushing other people to advocate for certain positions. And honestly, one of the most egregious things is there's something called the Oxford COVID-19 Evidence Service, and it says the major benefactors of which are Maria and David Willits. Now, it's worth pointing out the COVID-19 Evidence Service has nothing to do with the COVID, the actual research unit that is like one of the world's leading research units on COVID. It is not even peer reviewed. It is literally like a 4chan. It is literally like a blog that a doctor that they get that these two have chosen can basically just write up stuff on. But it's called the Oxford COVID-19 Evidence Service, which sounds 98% more respectable. And immediately, as soon as you see that on the title, and you kind of go, maybe this has some bearing on like literally anyone. Maybe this has some bearing on, and this has some like. It's terrifically deep and terrifically respectable. And honestly, no, not really. And this has been referenced several times in Spectator articles, in various newspapers. And honestly, this is in some ways, I end up slightly blaming the Spectator for going, you do realise Oxford would effortlessly tell you if you asked them that it has very little to do with them, and they don't, and you know, it's somebody's blog effectively. Okay,
So,
but like it's got the title Oxford. You know, why don't they like complain about the fact that it has this this title? You know, it does sound very respectable.
so that without getting into a massive discussion, we'll try not to anyway. But why do you think they're getting away with using that label? Because if anybody used like the NHS badge for nothing to for something nothing to do with the NHS, for example, would kick off about it, rightfully so. So why aren't the Oxford Union doing that?
Because they're
They're getting
allowed,
money.
basically. Like, I mean,
What isn't it bringing their name into disrepute?
you would have thought so. I mean, I think that. I think that there is one of the interesting discussions here is there is two types of crime,
Yeah,
and there's kind of crime that and there's an element here that I think that many of the people who see this will kind of go, well, you know, the fact it isn't, you know, many scientists will look at this, many professors will look at that and go, well, it says at the bottom that it isn't peer reviewed. Which, if you're a scientist, you know, you only cite papers that are peer reviewed. But if you're a journalist, like, you know, and so I think that there's a lost in translation element. I think though that my major problem here is that basically like the Willits are specifically leveraging their money to alter policy. And this is a very serious issue because in the end, like it's not that because in the end, like they as individuals will constantly be trying to work out ways of how to they'll constantly be trying to work out ways of how to push their positions. And in the end, it should in a society that values non-corruption, we should constantly have to be going, okay, but are we giving these people too much power? You know, it's fine for them to have money. I'm not going to get into it, but for the sake of this argument, it's fine for people to have money. It's not fine for people to just be able to use money to affect policy, because basically that's basically using your money as votes. We each get one vote. That is democracy. In the end, as soon as one person gets more than one vote, that is not democracy. That is oligarchy.
yeah.
And it's to some degree, it's a lot more recognized in the US, and it's kind of there's a lot, and it's, you know, they call them dark money networks and that kind of thing. But apparently, you know, it's happening in the UK too, and it's affecting its policy.
I would urge people to look at the connection between the Spectator and the people in power.
I mean, all newspapers have those kinds of connections to a degree.
They do exist, though. And you know, and there's something there. But I still go back to the surprise that Oxford Union would allow these people to use their name. Basically, that's all I'm getting at in this particular case, which is of a surprise to me. But there we go. But in terms of this actual petition, is there anything before we close that we should mention?
I mean, basically that it is the attempt of some highly influential and connected people to push for a policy that, again, if it, you know, to some degree, it's not. I have one vote just like anyone else, and it's not for me to say what is in any individual's interest. But I would say that this group apparently would not agree with those statements, and they are very directly going, well, we know what's best, and we will use a great deal more influence than I will ever have to actually to push for this thing. And in the end, like, I guess if you end up agreeing with it, that's kind of fine. But honestly, like, there should be I would hope there's a significant amount of edge cases and people who say no, who should actually go, well, this is wrong. And honestly, I would say from a more principled perspective that in the end, this is not how good policy is made. Just from a blunt, like, even if you think this is the best policy in the world, like, if you're constantly hoping that one or two rich people will agree with you in order to get your way, that's not democracy at that point. And it and just to say from a disability perspective, for a whole number of reasons, very few really rich people seem to want what's best for disabled people. So if you care about what's good for disabled people,
we can't necessarily make them boatloads of cash.
And very few disabled people end up being billionaires. You know, if the next time you see pictures of like the top 10 richest people in the world, then honestly,
you won't see us on there.
Notice how many of them are in wheelchairs.
Yeah.
Even amongst neurodiverse people, there's some arguments that one or two of them have dyslexia. But apparently, if you want to be a billionaire, then
yeah,
if you want to get in that particular club, apparently it's
autism. Our picture won't be there, will it?
So yeah. So certainly for disability policy related issues, if it's there should be we should definitely care a great deal that policy is not just handed down to us from billionaires.
Well, because they obviously don't have a day-to-day interest in it all, and they can live anywhere.
And if they want to, and to some degree, like if they do ever need to go in a wheelchair, they can remake their entire house to have ramps everywhere. They can have elevators. They can, can remake their limousine so it can take their wheelchairs. They can, they can choose they can they can buy houses in a neighborhood and revamp the entire thing so it's accessible.
Yeah. And going back to two-sidesisms, I'm talking about how that isn't always advisable, is it? And
I mean, I would argue that there's probably a lot more dense issues we could talk about with journalism. But I would say certainly I would say it's generally there seems to be science is a difficult issue because in the sense that it is both cultural and policy related. And generally, if you're dealing with cultural issues, I mean, for example, if you want to talk about like, I don't know, Catholics versus Protestants, how do you do that? There's no right answer. Have two sides, talk about both of them. Boom. And honestly, that's probably fine. I mean, there's discussions around when people start talking about prejudice and there's discussions around minority communities. But, it's not a bad way to go. There are worse ways. But I think especially when you start talking about policies and when you start talking about when you start talking about science, which there is by definition, the job of science is to find out the answer. And in some ways it can be mysterious, it can be gray, there can be some very technical discussions around it. But both-sidesisms is very rarely the way to go. And especially in a situation like this where there is a great deal of misinformation flying around, where there's a great deal of confusion, where honestly the policies that are necessary are pretty clear cut. you know, we can talk about like which medications are best, and we can talk about and there's a great deal of like very technical stuff that you could get into if you really want to do a both sides kind of discussion. You could even talk about kind of what is the best forms of lockdown, and what is the and what are the variables around. There are discussions to be had, but just doing what just talking about both sides of the lockdown issue, it you know it doesn't, you don't end up with a more factually accurate, you don't end up with a more um, intelligent worldview by looking at both of these sides.
No, you just end up with more confusion.
Yeah, and some people will go, well, I'm going to rebel against the people who want me to like stay in my who want me to lock down, and blah 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 blah, and that just and that ends up just making the entire situation worse, and making policies more impossible. And
Especially when this virus is only a year old as well. When we don't know everything about it yet.
I think one of the most complicated points about it as well is if you look at the is if you look at the is if you look at all of the graphs, then it is very counterintuitive to human beings. I mean, generally, when you look at like we're generally okay when you're talking about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, when you're talking about something like that. But honestly, when you're talking about I'm very irritated. I can't remember what the name. But basically, when you're talking about when you're talking about um, uh, when you're talking about the form of kind of when this is going to irritate me. Anyway, when you talk about when you talk about 1 doubles to 2, 2 doubles to 4, 4 doubles to, and when you do that, what you very often, what you get to just like very counterintuitively is, you get to some incredibly high numbers incredibly quickly.
Yeah.
And so honestly, like, that is one of the hardest elements of this for the human brain to kind of think about, because we end up going, well, only like 4 people died yesterday, or only 4 people got sick yesterday. So, we've still got another 6 months until we actually get to like, and no, you have 2 weeks. Like, and honestly, like, that is a very sharp curve that human beings just aren't used to dealing with in their everyday lives. And so in the end, there's a great deal of like counterintuitive stuff and just things that the brain isn't quite designed to deal with. And then that kind of compounds on itself, and then just human and the fact that this wouldn't be a terrible thing if a few human beings understood it, and just everybody else would just kind of not mess up their plan. But as soon as you start having to like as soon as you start having to make everyone learn from experience every single time, then the deaths will just they will be high.
But especially when there's a refusal to learn lessons.
I mean, that's another thing as well, that especially in the US, to a more limited degree in the UK, I'm going to be slightly generous. There is, Donald Trump doesn't care. He just, to a significant degree, he's just like, I think he doesn't regard sickness as something that happens to him. He just doesn't regard sickness as like something he wants to think about in his worldview. And so, and again, he gets sick, but then immediately he becomes a miracle worker, and he has holy blood because he has the immunity, which no one knows if he does. But anyway, so yeah, and that just utter like, no, I'm not learning from this. Like, it's worth pointing out that lockdown, what it's used for, is not as a permanent measure. It is as a thing so you can get test and trace and so you can get other policies online. It may be worth pointing out that Boris Johnson messed this up last time, and the reason why we may need to do another lockdown is because Boris Johnson didn't have the previous, because Boris Johnson didn't have a decent test and trace system. If we did, we would not have to lock down. But, you know, that's just a thing now, apparently.
So, any last words
Um,
on this podcast? I'll take that as a maybe.
I'm fine. I've spoken far too much.
Okay. Yeah. Last words from me. Yeah, I just think that again, overall, we should not waste time, and we should save life wherever we possibly can. And people should, learn lessons. I would say that was the lesson I've learned from this podcast. Bye bye.
Right. See you, people. Bye.